How you guys doing? Uh, I know this is this is a completely different uh, background. So I hope you guys like in the background, and maybe you guys will see why I really like Arizona. But so um, I think it's probably best to start this video with uh, a question of discernment, and it's been interesting because I feel like I'm trying to navigate, my place in Arizona. Even though it's only been like a week and a half, I'm trying to navigate, and it's there's always like these weird circumstances where if you don't start kind of like navigating now, just the way everything works, it's just gonna force you to postpone or navigate later, or never to navigate at all. Um, yeah, so I'm still struggling with the question of like my career choice, my path as such. uh right now there's about three options that I'm looking at, and I'm like trying to find, you know one thing I know for sure is that I definitely want to go back to school. um the question then becomes like, what is it that you want to go to school for? um Now, I think in my previous video, I said like I want to go to school for radiology, and it's you know what I ended up finding out about some of the programs for radiology in Tucson is that it's a very competitive program. Ironically, right? I mean, it for me, I find it interesting that it is a competitive program. Despite it only being like a associate level kind of science degree. But it's a competitive program nonetheless. So they only accept like 24 students a year. And there's only two programs in the whole entirety of Tucson, Arizona that, accept 24 students. Um, Now, I had to look at two schools for this because the first school that I got into, they ended up being, blatantly honest with me by saying that actually they only accept 8 students every year because they're so backfilled with the waiting list, and they had to stop the waiting list. And so there's people that have been waiting for 2 or 3 years just to get into the program. And, as much as I feel like, okay, just, gamble at it, maybe you become the 8 that get in. Um, I was kind of like, well, maybe this is something that, maybe this is kind of like, a sign or a closed door or half closed door that kind of showing me maybe this is not where I need to go, right? Um, so I think that's why I bring up the question of discernment, which gets a little difficult. But honestly, both of the radiology programs, they only accept 24 students every year. But the second radiology program that I was looking into, the only problem with that program is that they're not accepting students till next year of August because they got backfilled because of COVID, because hospitals weren't letting the students have, medical experience time, or I forgot what the word is, but clinical experience. There you go. So that's backlogged, right? So I have two options that no matter which one I choose for the radiology program, it doesn't matter in terms of like I have to wait either way. Um, the first choice is a gamble, right? Only 8 students technically get in because they're incorporating the waiting list from the previous years to add up to the 24. And then the next program is Again, only 24, but it's a more they sort of weed out like a 500 applicant process by going through like interviews and stuff like that. Um, the second one seems more promising because I have medical experience. Um, I have associate's degree and so on. So I'm in the ballpark for the second program. But anyways, the reason why I talk about discernment, and this is going to lead into the whole God's trap, is that I was having a conversation with my best friend the other day, and he doesn't claim to be a part of any religion, but he believes in a God as such, and we were having this interesting conversation about um, basically discernment. At first, it was about children and so on, and it was a very interesting perspective, and this is again what I came up with the idea of the God trap, because what ended up happening was we had this conversation about it was a very interesting conversation about children, where I was like, you know, from a theological point of view, right, and even from a biological point of view, we understand that if you're trying to have a child, it's always a probability. Like sex doesn't mean that you're going to instantly create a child. There's always a probability through the act of sex that you may or may not get a child. So there's scientifically it always boils down to a probability. And there's always those interesting cases where there's people that simply can't have children. And so I was, I was expressing to him that, a theological point of view would say that, um, being able, having a child, being pregnant is a blessing, right? It would be a blessing from God as such. And he was expressing that he would still, if he was expressing that he wouldn't want a child because it's just not the right time. Um, and the circumstances don't fit, right? Circumstances don't fit, and it's just not appropriate. So if they were to have a child, they probably, him and his partner would probably kind of dropping by, say hi, Javier. Glad to hear from you. We'll watch later. Oh, thanks, Will. So yeah, my best friend was saying that it's not a right time to have a child. So most likely he would probably resort to like an abortion and stuff with his partner. Now we ended up getting into this friendly disagreement about how I was making a theological case of like, look, I mean, the probability of there's always a case of having the probability of having a child from a theological point of view proves that it would be a blessing if you were to actually, if the person were to become pregnant as such. And, he disagreed. And he disagreed in the sense of like, well, there's always that case that it just isn't realistically viable right now, right? Financially, and all these other cases that he was making. And so here comes the notion of the God trap, right? So the God trap is, you can make this argument about how God, knows, and you don't, right? Which was basically my position in the beginning. Actually, I don't know what my position is, after this conversation. But so my position was, God knows and I don't. So, you kind of just deal with the blessing as such. Now, my best friend argued, well, I made the argument for him. Because I said, well, you could say in response, playing devil's advocate for him, was that actually you can say, well, God gave us reason and rationality. So you can always argue that, of course, like God would want us to think and be rational and reason. So, clearly we can discern that, if I decide it's not the right time, then it would be using the reason and the rationality that God gave us. So, and, he was, and I basically, by playing devil's advocate against myself, he accepted that position, right? He's like, yes, that's right. Um, and so, and this is exactly what I call like the God's trap, where it boils down to this idea of you don't actually know. Like you just don't know. You don't know at all. Um, Again, I feel like both positions are, completely viable. Something I always hear from, Muslims and so on is, and some Christians, is that, yeah, reason and rationality, they would be technically a gift from God. So to make decisions as such, you probably should use your reason and rationality, and that would be, using God's gifts, and that, in some sense, that would also be a blessing. So you see, like, the kind of situation that we're in, right? Do we say that, we claim that we don't know, and that God knows, so then we call it a blessing as such, even though I'm still technically claiming that I know? um, but the one part about his position, the one part that's weak about that, is that you're assuming through your reason and rationality that you have the right discernment, right? You could say, in a theological position, that you have the right guidance as such by using reason and rationality, right? Are you using reason and rationality towards your own whims, or are you using reason and rationality that is, guided? Um, so for me, that was like the weakness of that position. But at the same time, with the other position, the position that I was taking, it comes into the same problem. You're assuming, like, uh, basically you're assuming like you can't use reason, or some type of rationality. You're just kind of, um, having like almost like a blind faith, that you're just willing to suffer and accept, and consider this a blessing as such, or a trial. I don't know what the case would be. um, but it made it, I thought the interaction was such a good interaction, because fundamentally it showed that if we take God seriously, we run into these traps where there's this figurative element of our conception of God, and it corresponds with our receptivity. It corresponds with, our ideas. And Thomas Merton, in the New Seeds of Contemplation, he writes a wonderful piece, a little short meditation on how everybody has their own conception of what Jesus is. And that's basically what gave me this idea, is that, yes, actually everybody has their own conception of God. So is there any point, and this is the paradoxical trap, is there any point about discussing as such? Um, is there any point about, um, going so deep into these issues, or these types of discernment, that you're trying to say, well, I think God is this way, and that he's behaving this way, while another person would say, I disagree, I think God is behaving this way. um, you know and it's funny, because it actually reminds me of the story of Jacob, where it's this, where all of his friends are basically saying, well, obviously you're being punished, and you're suffering, so you must have done something wrong, you must have sinned, and you're just not admitting it, and so on. And what I love about the Jacob story in the Bible is that, at least God God actually punishes all three of his friends, all three of Jacob's friends, for trying to act as if they know, act as if they could speak on God's behalf. And even though Jacob did his own faultiness, he didn't do it as severely as, the other three, as his friends. So I think that was interesting. The other thing when we're talking about discernment is some of my side thoughts about atheism and nihilism. Most people make the case for nihilism and atheism to sort of be like the indicators that we must leave leave religion as such, or so on. I would say at least in my experience, most people that dominate in those positions have the tendency to say to have discard religion as such. Now I can't say that's necessarily true for my cohorts, my friends, my philosophical you know comrades. uh, they acknowledge the necessity of religion, so um, I would say that they are definitely the exception in those cases where they would accept like maybe a nihilist affirmative position, and still acknowledge the necessity of religion and push forward with a religion that sort of you know would fit to metaphysical and ontological necessities, and so on. But I also thought it was interesting to think of nihilism and atheism as positions that fundamentally don't actually escape, and this also would include the God's trap. It fundamentally doesn't escape the the conception, right? It doesn't escape uh, the conception of God at all, meaning that the only God that is dead is just a specific conception of God um, that has caused, harm or ruin and so on, right? It's it's fell apart. Um, and for me, like I feel like this is the God trap. Actually, in my opinion, like God would have to die 1,000 times in order for us to start understanding what do we mean by God anymore. What are we saying by that? There's other problems with just some of my other work that I've been contemplating on is that one, we spend too much time thinking God rather than experiencing God, which is a huge problem. And in my opinion, actually, nihilism and atheism are a result of mainly thinking God and not experiencing God. Right? This is a completely different perspective. Right? Most philosophical avenues are simply thinking God. Right? I forget which book I was. I think it was The Introduction to Hegel by I already forgot his name, but he was pointing out the weaknesses of saying that there's a God outside of time and so on, and he shows like the how that would be an incoherent position. Again, for me, this wouldn't prove anything as such. It would only prove that it actually, in my opinion, this is what it proves. It actually proves that experiencing God is actually far superior than trying to think God. Um, Trying to think God, you fall into, again, the God's trap. The God's trap is the idea, that we can fathom as such. But of course, that again, the other paradox is that if you don't accept a God as such, then of course God is thinkable, right? Of course. And of course this would follow into the nihilist and atheist position. It's like, of course God is thinkable because God isn't something that is a real or tangible or the reality. So of course you can think God and show that it's incoherent. um, and I think a lot of the mistake of theology which Whitehead pointed out when I read his work on, I think, what's it called, like Science and Religion, something like that, where Whitehead points out that, basically it was religion that brought rationality, brought rationality and reason to the scene. Um, and it's funny how, now science and religion have sort of this dichotomy with each other, when it was actually, at least this is what, from what I remember, I'm not willing to die on this hill, but I'd have to look at it again. But that's actually the conception I got when I read the book. So, yeah, so I think Whitehead's case about how, religious people trying to prove God through reason and rationality is actually what created science and this whole concept of, being rational and so on. Which is funny because it ended up making, basically detaching it. Like, they created concepts and things that detach, or fields that detach themselves from theology or religion. And I think that's like that funny paradox. And again, this is what I would call like the God's trap. It's what the thing that you're trying to prove gets further away from itself, essentially. And if I just want to talk about my personal opinions on this, I'm never really, like, I really hate the idea of like proving God. I really like the whole thing, like, just, and this is probably a strong word, but the whole thing really just disgusts me in general. Like the whole idea of like proving God, that whole concept, that whole method, it makes me sick. Like, if I'm being honest, it makes me sick. And again, I think this proves for me at least, it proves the point of like, there is this significant difference between, we're living in a world that's always been trying to think God rather than experience God. And I think, right, I think what's fascinating about this is that we'd understand that science itself is, its methodology is basically experimentation and observation, right? So fundamentally, when we look at theology or religion has those same things. The thing is, nobody wants to necessarily experience or experiment with prayer, or experiment with certain certain fundamental religious sacraments or mysteries. They don't want to experiment with those. But I think if you experiment with those, you'd understand that you're actually doing a very, scientific thing, or actually it's very in parallel with science, right? You can have a hypothesis as such. The only thing that you need to do, just like science, is that you need to have trials and experimentation. You need to have this sort of radical repetition, and in hopes that you may experience something, you may discover something. I think that is far more superior than simply trying to theoretically place God in a philosophical bubble or a theological box. Um, for me, that is far more superior. And once you experiment, then we can start having our theoretical discussions and philosophical ideas about the God as such. But until we stop this division, or at least till we stop this fascination with always trying to think God rather than experience God, then we're always going to fall into the essential traps of, just everything. Just everything in general. I mean, even trying to talk people about God today, it's reduced to, well, God created the universe, and there's this contingency, and obviously it proves that there's contingency because we can't have an infinite regression. We can't possibly think of an infinite regression, something like that. I mean, I don't know. Again, just all apologetic arguments, essentially. actually think C.S. Lewis makes, some better arguments, meaning like he actually thinks that the moral argument is perhaps stronger, um, which was interesting. And just to briefly share, C.S. Lewis writes in Mere Christianity that the idea or the concept of good and evil, um, we can't say that good and evil, we can't reduce good and evil to an instinct, because if you think about the idea of the fact that we believe in choosing between good and evil, shows implicitly that there's a third in there, meaning that the third is exactly the standard, that the standard is that we must try to pick the good, right? Or that we know what is good, but we still pick, the evil option. So he's saying, so he's saying, so he's saying that there must be something beyond uh, the good and evil, the dichotomy, because it would involve a law, and it would involve a standard that is always bearing upon the human being. And so for him, this is a stronger argument. Um, and I mean, I agree. But again, for me, I'm not typically a fan of arguing from a position of morality. I'm not. I argue from a position of intimacy, which is completely different. Um, because I believe only from an argument of intimacy you can actually understand the necessity of laws, um, rather than looking at them as obligations or condemnations or sacrifices as such. You'd understand that if you believe in a divine principle, you're just trying to have a relationship with a human, like basically trying to have a relationship with a divine principle is like trying to have a relationship with a human being. I mean, there's just things that we don't understand, um, but it's only basically through our effort and through the struggle, and there's got to be love in there, that we try to understand and have a relationship with anything, and just in general. Um, so, you know, if we think about God as relationships, as human relationships, not as God as some abstract thing. And I think that's why, the whole Jesus thing is always interesting, because it shows fundamentally that the way that we can connect to a divine principle is by being able to connect to man himself. So, yeah, I'm losing sight of my thought here, but I know I'm saying lots of things. So, but yeah, I I think that's it right now. So relationships, yeah, divine relationships as such, we'd understand that. Um, to also briefly share with you now, because I've opened the wormhole for C.S. Lewis. I actually think C.S. Lewis makes, again, very interesting arguments for Christianity, and I mean, I don't even consider them apologetic. They're just very intriguing. Um, it's also fascinating to know that C.S. Lewis was like an atheist for most of his life. Thanks to Michelle for that one. She gave me that info. So you can check her, not me, on those facts. But yeah, the argument of evil that C.S. Lewis makes is that technically everything is good in itself. It's just the methodology, the way we approach the good in itself, that can become evil. My favorite example now is kind of like citing the idea of like sex, right? Like sex itself is not bad inherently. It's not inherently bad. The only thing that is inherently bad about sex is the way we approach sex, right? For example, the way people exploit people for sex, or the way people force sex on each other, and stuff like that. Like it's the way we approach the good in itself that becomes evil as such. And if we want to talk about money, like money in itself is not inherently bad. It's just the way we use that money. It's the way we exploit for money. It's the way we approach money that becomes evil in itself. So again, I actually thought that was probably the most powerful argument against the more the very common atheistic arguments for like, I don't understand why God would let this happen and stuff like that. And C.S. Lewis, basically brilliantly uh, points out that in reality, you know, if we believe in such a divine principle that there's, and if it wanted us to acknowledge him, well, there's no point in making us acknowledge him if we don't have free will to do so, right? It's just like everything would just be like this robotic submission. So if a divine principle wants to be acknowledged, then it already comes with the paradox of the free will, the fact that I can choose to not acknowledge or acknowledge. um, and of course, the only way that love can exist is the very fact within these paradoxes of free will, right? The idea that I can choose to acknowledge somebody with effort, with striving to have a relationship, to have a what we call love. And I think that was brilliantly put by C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity. But other than that, I think I've rambled enough about discernment, the God trap, uh, some atheism and nihilism, the problem between thinking and experiencing God. And yeah. So, anyways, I hope you guys are doing well. Let me know if you guys have any questions. And yeah, okay. Take care.